Every piece of earth we walk on has a story. Some are written in books, others only in footsteps. Tonight we open one of those trails, the one history tried to silence, the Trail of Tears. Listen closely, because the land still remembers. The air is brittle. Frost gathers on the canvas edges of army tents, and the sound of wagon wheels creaks against ice that has begun to split beneath their weight. In the gray light before dawn, a slow column of people moves west, shawls drawn tight, children pressed against their mothers' backs, the breath of oxen steaming into the wind. Boots strike the frozen mud in rhythm, not the rhythm of marching soldiers, but of those who walk because they have no choice left. A single drumbeat carries from the rear, faint and hollow, trying to keep pace with the cracking of whips and the rasp of harness chains. The soldiers wear coats of blue wool. The people they guard, the Cherokee, the Aniunwia, wear what they could salvage when the agents came. Strands of beadwork glint against the cold, a few carry woven baskets that once held cornmeal, now filled with snow for water. A woman bends to pick up a small clay pipe dropped in the slush, wipes it clean, tucks it into her sash. Somewhere ahead, the river bends into mist, and beyond it the road splits. One route south toward Memphis, the other northwest toward Cape Girardeau. The decision will be made by men who do not walk beside them. The horizon is blurred smoke from soldiers' fires mixing with low fog off the water. A boy coughs until he can no longer stand, his mother's voice cracking as she calls for help that does not come. Behind them, an officer's horse snorts impatient, the iron bit clattering against frozen reins. From the ridge above, a crow circles, calling once, then silence. No one answers, not the men with muskets, not the elders who once sang to the dawn. Only the slow grind of wagon wheels resumes. This is the winter the records will later call the removal. But to those walking, there is no word for what they are leaving, only the land that refuses to release its sound. They cross the river by ferry boards slick with ice. The current catches the hull and spins it slightly, revealing the dark expanse of the opposite bank, wild, unbroken, unfamiliar. A soldier shouts for order. The rope groans. The ferry drifts forward. In a nearby ledger, an army clerk writes the date, the count of those departed this morning. He underlines it twice. The ink freezes mid-stroke. By spring, this road will have a name whispered first among survivors, then drawn on maps in Washington: the Trail of Tears. A path that will redraw a nation's borderlines not with ink, but with silence. They say the fracture began long before the first wagons rolled west, before the frost and the river crossings. It began on paper on a map that could never hold still. For centuries, the Cherokee Nation had marked its borders not with fences or stones, but with rivers, the Hiwassee, the Etowah, the Tennessee. The land was language. Every ridge and hollow carried a name that described not possession, but belonging. But as white settlement moved southward from Virginia and Carolina, the rivers became boundaries of another kind, lines of claim deeds and surveys signed in ink that ignored what already lived there. By 1802, a bargain had been struck between Georgia and the United States, the Compact of 1802, promising that the federal government would remove all native title within Georgia's claimed borders. It was a line drawn in silence, an invisible pressure that would not stop tightening until every indigenous community east of the Mississippi was displaced. For the Cherokee, the early 1800s were a time of uneasy adaptation. They built schools, mills, and a constitution modeled after the new republic. Sequoyah completed his syllabary in 1821, giving the Cherokee Nation a written language, and with it, a printed newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. But literacy could not outright the hunger for land. The first fracture widened when gold was discovered in the Cherokee Hills of northern Georgia in 1829. Thousands of miners poured into Dahlonega and Auraria, cutting roads through sacred valleys, digging up burial grounds. The Georgia legislature passed new laws extending state authority over Cherokee land, declaring it illegal for native councils to meet or for any non-licensed white person to live among them, even missionaries. By 1830, the Indian Removal Act passed Congress by a margin of just 5 votes. President Andrew Jackson signed it into law. With a smile, historians still quote, "They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement." In that moment, the fate of entire nations was decided by the distance between signatures and silence. Jackson's policy offered exchange land west of the Mississippi for what they already held east of it, but the exchange was never equal. The lands of the West were marked as barren on government maps, while the Cherokee heartland was thick with rivers, oak, and fertile soil. A small faction of Cherokee, weary of threats and bribed with promises, signed the Treaty of New Echota in December 1835, without authorization from their elected council, without the consent of Chief John Ross or the majority of the nation. That single document, ratified by the U.S. Senate in 1836, gave legal cover to a removal that had already begun in secret. Behind the treaties, there were contracts for transport, for rations, for subsistence allowances. Merchants from Tennessee and Kentucky bid on who would feed and carry the displaced. The trail was an economy before it became a tragedy. By 1837, federal surveyors divided Cherokee territory into lots to be distributed by the Georgia Land Lottery. Families who had lived for generations near the Coosawattee or the Oostanala were replaced by strangers drawing numbered slips from wooden barrels in Milledgeville. The fracture deepened not only between nations, but within them. Some Cherokee believed removal was inevitable. Others resisted through petitions, delegations, and appeals to the Supreme Court. In Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall declared that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct community occupying its own territory. But Jackson, when told of the decision, reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." The map shifted again, not through battle, but through refusal, the refusal of a government to recognize its own law. Meanwhile, other nations, the Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole, were already on the move westward, their paths marked by the bones of those who did not survive. The Choctaw called their removal the Trail of Tears and Death. Few yet realized that the same words would soon describe the Cherokee. Disease followed the soldiers: measles, cholera, pneumonia, spreading through camps where families waited for months under guard, crowded in stockades with little food or shelter. Horses grew thin, infants died unnamed. In letters to Washington, Army officers complained about lack of supplies, but the requisitions had been miscounted or stolen before they reached Tennessee. Each miscalculation became a death not recorded in any official return. Economically, the removal served two purposes: to clear cotton land for expansion and to open gold fields to white miners. Politically, it affirmed the young republic's belief that progress required erasure, that a map could only be made new if someone else's map was destroyed. Socially, the policy fractured the native world itself. The mixed heritage elite who had adopted European dress and education found themselves distrusted by both sides. Full-blood traditionalists who refused conversion were called savages in government memos. Families divided, some joining removal parties, early others hiding in the mountains of North Carolina, forming what would later become the Eastern Band of Cherokee. Everywhere lines were being redrawn, between citizens and subjects, between civilized and savage, between those who could speak English and those whose language was disappearing by decree. The forts multiplied: Fort Cass, Fort Payne, Fort Mitchell, each a node on the new geography of containment. Soldiers mapped routes west as if tracing veins through a living body, ignoring the blood that would follow. When the first detachments began their march in the summer of 1838, the land itself had already been conquered, not by battle, but by law, paper, and hunger. Behind every proclamation lay a network: land, speculators, bankers, local militias, and church missions, arguing over civilization funds. In northern Georgia alone, more than 53,000 white settlers filed claims within months of Cherokee removal orders. The drive for land was not chaos, it was a system deliberate and profitable. And yet amid that machinery, some voices tried to resist. Missionary Samuel Worcester wrote from prison, "We have prayed for mercy in a government that no longer hears." Chief John Ross petitioned Congress, "We are not foreigners. We are a people who have lived with you beside you." His words were tabled, never read aloud in the House. What emerged was a landscape of silence, a republic expanding by forgetting. The fracture of the map was not just territorial, it was moral. A young nation built its identity on the claim of liberty, while drawing borders through the graves of those who had sheltered it during its own revolution. By the time winter arrived in 1838, the roads west were ready, the stockades were full, the contracts had been signed, and the people still waited for a decision that had already been made. From the air had there been eyes above, then one could have seen the geometry of displacement, forming the blue tents of soldiers dotting river valleys, the white smudge of smoke over confiscated farms, the black lines of wagon trails threading toward the horizon. The map was fractured not by accident, but by design. And when the first column began to move toward the Mississippi, toward the lands that would become Indian territory, it was not merely a march of bodies. It was the movement of a nation being redrawn in silence. In the winter of 1838, as detachments formed under military guard, one man's name began appearing again and again in the Army ledgers: John Ross. He was not born a stranger to the new republic. His father was a Scottish trader, his mother a woman of the Byrd clan. He grew up along the banks of the Coosa River, speaking both Cherokee and English, learning how to read the currents of each world. By the time he was 20, he had fought beside American troops in the War of Boyne 1812, not against the United States, but alongside General Jackson himself, defending the southern frontier. His courage earned him letters of praise, his education earned him the role of translator, and his loyalty, or what they called loyalty, then earned him trust. But trust for the Cherokee was a currency that rarely held its value. When the treaties began to multiply, Ross turned from interpreter to negotiator. He wrote petitions in English to Congress, letters in Cherokee to his council, warning that the language of the law was not a bridge, but a trap. His handwriting was small, deliberate, never rushed. In the archives of Washington, you can still see the indentations of his pen where he pressed too hard, as if force alone could carve permanence into words. He was elected principal chief in 1828, the same year Georgia passed the first laws stripping the Cherokee Nation of its authority. From that point on, every decision he made would be shadowed by the sound of a map being erased. Ross lived in a two-story house at head of Coosa, a wooden desk by the window facing east. On it, a single compass brass worn smooth, and beside it, a small woven pouch of red clay soil from his grandmother's home near the Etowah. When asked years later why he kept the earth in that pouch, he said, "Because the ground remembers what people forget." He wanted only one thing to keep his people on their land, but every year the circle of protection narrowed. He traveled to Washington 6 times, crossing the mountains by horseback, enduring snow fever and delay. In one letter he wrote, "If we are to vanish, let it not be said we went without voice." Yet, as pressure-mounted factions splintered, Major Ridge, once his ally, began to believe that resistance would lead only to annihilation. It was Ridge and his son who signed the Treaty of New Echota without Ross, without consent, without the authority of the nation. For Ross, that betrayal was not abstract. It was personal. His own kin were among those who would now call him traitor to survival. When federal troops arrived in 1838, Ross was detained. His home seized, his papers confiscated. Among them were maps of the removal routes he had drawn by hand, not as plans but as warnings. In the margins he wrote notes in both languages. "They will need salt here. Do not cross this river in winter." Even as his authority was stripped, he remained a line of continuity, a leader without an army, a voice without a government. Witnesses later recalled that Ross never shouted. When the first detachments prepared to leave, he stood near the lead wagon wrapped in a wool cloak, watching as families climbed aboard. He carried no weapon, no insignia, only the compass and the small pouch of soil. A soldier who saw him that day wrote, "He said nothing, but the people moved when he did." That was leadership as the Cherokee understood it, not command, but endurance. Ross feared not death, but forgetting. He knew that what frightened his people most was not the loss of land, but the loss of meaning, the breaking of kinship lines that stretched farther than the horizon. In the years that followed, he would continue west, guiding his people through flood, disease, and hunger. He would bury his wife Quaddy along the trail near Little Rock, her grave marked only by a rough cedar cross. He never spoke of that morning again. John Ross represented more than a man. He embodied a principle that leadership was not about surviving the journey, but about ensuring that memory did. And when the trail finally ended, the compass and the pouch were still with him, proof that even in exile, direction and belonging could not be legislated away. At dawn, the bugle called a single metallic note that split the fog. Horses stirred, muskets clattered against saddle straps, and in the stillness between sounds, the ground seemed to hold its breath. General Winfield Scott had arrived 3 days earlier, carrying orders signed in Washington. His handwriting on the dispatch was neat, the words formal. "The emigration of the Cherokee people will now commence. All remaining within the limits of the states of North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama must be collected and removed to the designated territory west of the Mississippi." The signature that ended the letter sealed more than paper. It ended a nation's claim to its homeland. Scott, a veteran of earlier wars, wore a uniform trimmed with gold braid. His officers addressed him as Old Fuss and Feathers, a man of precision and temper. Yet even he would later write that this duty, the melancholy duty of carrying into effect the will of the government, was among the most painful of his career. Around him, nearly 7,000 soldiers of the U.S. Army spread across the valleys, their camps forming a net around the Cherokee settlements. The forts Caspayne and Butler became holding stations. Orders flowed outward. Every detachment was to move by force if persuasion failed. The first arrests began at sunrise. Troops rode into villages still wet with dew, knocking on cabin doors, ordering families to gather what they could carry. Some soldiers were gentle, others not. Livestock was driven off corn bins broken open. Children hid in lofts or behind smokehouses clutching small carved toys. A mother tried to take her weaving loom. The sergeant told her there was no room for that where you're going. At Ross's Landing, the place now called Chattanooga steamboats waited at the river's edge, engines hissing. One by one, chickens arrived from outlying farms filled with people whose names would never be written down. Officers counted them as heads or souls. The official reports called it emigration, but the soldiers called it roundup. John Ross was taken under guard to Fort Cass, where he watched as lists were made, family names, numbers, villages of origin. His own home had already been seized, his furniture auctioned to settlers. In his absence, the council house at New Echota was looted, its records burned. The removal had begun not with a march, but with a silence, the silence of locked doors. One Cherokee boy, 13 years old, later told a missionary, "They came before breakfast. My father asked if he could feed the baby first. The soldier said, 'The baby will eat on the road.'" By the end of the first week, more than 13,000 Cherokee had been taken into custody, herded into stockades built hastily from pine posts. Disease spread quickly. Measles, dysentery, and fever moved through the crowded pens. The smell of smoke and sickness hung in the air. An officer's journal from Fort Payne records the entry. Many of the Indians refuse to eat. They sit upon the ground, heads bowed as if waiting for some command not written in our orders. At Fort Cass, the stockade held more than 5,000 people. Their songs rose at night low and rhythmic, carrying through the trees. Guards called it chanting. They did not know it was prayer. Across the hills, the trigger moment, the moment when talk became movement, came on June 5, 1838, when Scott's final warning expired. His proclamation was read aloud in Cherokee and English. "The time is at hand when the people must move. Those who resist will be compelled by arms. Let none delay." The people listened unmoving. Then slowly the elders stood. They began to pack. No battle, no uprising, only compliance shaped by exhaustion. The fuse had burned quietly, and now the spark caught. Ross petitioned again for a delay until autumn, pleading that the summer heat would kill many along the way. Scott, reluctant, granted a brief postponement. For a few weeks, the people waited in the camps, enduring fever, watching the fields die untended. Then came August, and with it the first detachments by water. On August 28th, a steamboat called Harkins pushed off from Ross's Landing, carrying 466 Cherokee bound for Indian Territory. The river was low, the current sluggish. Passengers huddled on deck beneath makeshift awnings. Children coughed. A woman wept when the shoreline disappeared behind the trees. The officer in charge recorded in his report, "The Indians appeared melancholy but orderly. They sang hymns during the night. Yet even the river turned against them. Cholera broke out among one of the early groups. Within days, entire families were buried in hastily dug graves along the banks of the Mississippi. Word spread back to the camps, and fear took root. Many refused to board the boats. They said the river carried death. By late September, the order changed again. The remainder would go by land. That single adjustment sealed the tragedy that history would remember. Now the movement would be measured not in miles per hour of current, but in steps, millions of them, through forest mud and snow. On October 1st, 1838, the first of 16 overland detachments assembled near Fort Cass. John Ross, still under supervision, was allowed to lead his own party. Each group averaged about 1,000 people, guarded by soldiers supplied with wagons and oxen. The official directive stated, "Each detachment will move with discipline and regularity. Officers will prevent all unnecessary delay." But discipline could not mend the weather. Rains came early that autumn, turning roads into rivers of clay. Wagons sank, shoes split. Men carried the elderly on their backs across streams. Women gave birth beside the road. At night, they built small fires from damp wood, wrapping children in scraps of blankets too thin to stop the wind. A missionary traveling with one group wrote, "They are dying quietly. Each morning begins with a grave." The event that triggered the Trail of Tears was not a single explosion. It was a slow ignition across thousands of lives. It began with a paper signed in Washington, continued with a bugle note at Fort Cass, and spread through villages that woke to find themselves surrounded. No gunfire marked the beginning, only the sound of wheels and weeping. When the detachments finally set out October through December 1838, witnesses described the scene a procession, stretching for miles, wagons covered in frost, the line disappearing into the horizon. The army surgeon at Fort Cass wrote, "The sick are placed upon wagons, many without covering. The children cry continually. I fear the winter will destroy a great number." And it did. But at that moment, that first morning, when the wagons creaked forward, the people did not yet know how long the road would be. They only knew that staying was no longer possible. The fuse had been lit months earlier, when the Treaty of New Echota was ratified without consent. The explosion came not in noise, but in absence of choice of home of recognition. By December, the valleys of Tennessee stood empty, fires gone cold, doors swinging in the wind. The soldiers called it completion of duty. The people called it something else, though no word in English could hold it. What forced them to move was not one man's cruelty nor one day's command, but a system of silence perfected over years. And from that silence, the long march began. November 11th, 1838, the Tennessee River near Blythe's Ferry, eastern Tennessee. The river moved slow that morning, thick with mist and ice. Wind pressed against the canvas covers of the wagons, snapping them like brittle sails. Soldiers stamped their feet for warmth. The breath of the horses rose in clouds. Beyond the trees, the low hum of orders carried across the water, curt metallic final. This was the narrow point, the chosen crossing for the western route. On one side, the last ground of the Cherokee homeland. On the other, the first mile of exile. The Army engineers had measured the width, checked the current, reinforced the ferry planks with chains and oak beams. But what they could not measure was the weight of thousands waiting in silence. For General Scott's officers, the objective was clear: move every detachment west before the rivers froze. For John Ross and his people, the objective was simpler: survive the crossing. Each side believed time was the enemy, but the river would prove otherwise. At first light, the ferries began their run. Each could hold 2 wagons and 40 passengers. Oxen were led aboard, hooves sliding on wet wood. The first raft pushed off the current, catching it broadside before the polesman corrected course. A drummer on shore beat a slow rhythm, not for ceremony, but to keep order. 1 drum beat every 3 strokes of the pole. The sound carried downstream, dull against the fog. Mid-river, the wind shifted north. Ice drifted from upstream, small at first, thin sheets that tinkled against the hull, then larger slabs creaking, spinning. The ferrymen shouted to keep balance. Women clutched bundles wrapped in deerskin. Children buried their faces against their mothers' skirts. Somewhere in the middle of the river, a wagon shifted its weight and the plank cracked. The creak became a pop, the kind that precedes disaster, but the raft held, barely. On shore, Ross watched from horseback, his cloak drawn tight. His face betrayed nothing, yet his hands trembled against the reins. The soldier beside him recorded later. He looked not at the water, but at the far bank, as if distance itself were the only enemy left. By midday, the fog lifted, revealing the full scale of the operation. More than 12,000 people, 645 wagons, 5,000 horses and oxen. The line of movement stretched for nearly 2 miles. The goal was to cross before nightfall, but the wind had other plans. A squall came out of the northwest, sudden, sharp, carrying sleet that turned the ferries into sheets of glass. The men on the ropes lost grip. 1 raft swung wide, spinning in the current, colliding with another. 2 oxen broke their harnesses and plunged into the water. A child screamed. Soldiers waded in waist deep to pull them out. The journal of Lieutenant Rains reads simply, "At 3 o'clock, confusion. The river rose near a foot in less than an hour. Command faltered. Orders shouted upriver took minutes to reach the lower bank. And then came the mistake, small, almost invisible, that changed the day. An officer, fearing delay, ordered the next group to embark before the first had cleared the far side. For a moment, 3 ferries crowded the mid-channel, the ropes crossing like tangled veins. When one snapped under the strain, the current took hold. The raft swung downstream, scraping the others, tearing loose a corner of planking. A wagon wheel rolled off into the water. Then the ice finished, but the ropes could not. One section broke free, tilted, and half the passengers went into the river. The soldiers on shore froze, not from cold, but shock. Within minutes, 6 were gone. 3 adults, 3 children. The survivors clung to the wreckage until rescue boats reached them. No shots fired, no battle cries, just the river claiming what orders could not control. The Army reports called it an unfortunate accident. The people who watched called it something older, a sign that the land itself refused to release them. When darkness fell, torches lined both banks. The wind dropped, the river turned black. Fires burned through the night, their smoke drifting low across the water. The soldiers kept working ferry after ferry until their hands bled. By dawn, most of the eastern shore was empty. Yet the cost was already visible. Cattle drowned, wagons broken, infants sick from exposure. One detachment surgeon recorded 32 deaths that week, chiefly from chill and fatigue. Still, they moved on. The terrain beyond the river was no kinder. Low ridges, bare trees, frozen mud that clung to every step. The Army supply wagons meant to follow parallel to the trail bogged down within days. Cornmeal ran short. The quartermaster sent word back to Knoxville for rations, but the wagons never arrived. Roads washed out. Bridges collapsed. Every delay became another grave by the roadside. The Army's objective to maintain schedule began to erode with the weather. Ross's objective to keep the people alive collided with it at every turn. The environment, not the rifle, dictated the outcome. By late November, the temperature dropped below freezing. Horses' manes were stiff with frost. At night, the people built walls of brush to break the wind. Soldiers recorded that some detachments used bits of wagon canvas to wrap the feet of the elderly. Children slept inside barrels to escape the cold. On December 2nd, near the western edge of Tennessee, the line stalled again. Ice covered the road ahead. A decision had to be made: push forward or wait. Ross gathered the guides, traced the map in the dirt with a stick. He pointed west, then north, then back east. None of the routes promised safety. The Army urged movement: "You must proceed. Delay will destroy discipline." Ross answered with a single phrase: "Then discipline will bury the dead." They waited 2 days. When the thaw came, it was rain, endless cold dissolving the roads. But the pause saved hundreds. Sometimes the only strategy left was to stop. That was the turning point. The pivot of the campaign, though, no historian called it that. The moment when terrain weather and human endurance merged into a single equation neither side could control. For the Army, the ground was an obstacle to schedule. For the Cherokee, it was the last ally that still spoke their language. Every hill, every stream remembered their stories. And the land in its cruelty also protected them, slowing the soldiers, erasing their timelines. By the time the detachments reached the Mississippi in early December, winter had hardened the soil into stone. The crossing of the Tennessee, that first trial by water, had reshaped the plan entirely. No longer a swift emigration by schedule, now a crawl measured by loss. Reports from the quartermasters began using a new phrase under duress of season. What had started as control was now survival for everyone involved. When the final wagons cleared the western bank of the Tennessee, the soldiers fired a single cannon, not in triumph, but as signal to the next post that the crossing was complete. The echo rolled through the valley, startling the birds from the trees. Some said it sounded like thunder. Others said it was the river answering back. On that day, no maps changed hands, no treaties were signed, yet the world shifted. The crossing at Blythe's Ferry proved what the documents could not, that policy written in ink becomes something else when it touches the ground. The fuse that had been lit in Washington now burned through ice, rope, and bone, and the land itself, indifferent immense, had chosen its side. You can still stand there today. The river is quiet now. A small historical marker names the place, the dates, the numbers. But beneath the current, the iron fittings of the old ferry remain rusting among the stones. On winter mornings, when mist lifts from the surface, locals say the sound of chains returns faint, rhythmic, like oars striking water. It is not a haunting, it is memory repeating itself through time. Because here, in the geography of removal, the true power never belonged to men or laws. It belonged to the ground, the weather, and the river that would not forget. January 1839. The northern route through Kentucky and southern Illinois. The snow was thin that winter, but the cold was sharp enough to cut through every layer of cloth. The roads were lined with tracks, oxen wagons, bare feet. And somewhere between the towns of Golconda and Jonesboro, history split in two. On paper, the crossing was efficient. In one letter dated January 17, 1839, Captain William J. Rogers of the U.S. Army wrote to his superior, "The detachments of the Cherokee emigrants under my observation have conducted themselves with great decorum and fortitude. The number of deaths has been fewer than might be expected given the severity of the season. Rations have been distributed regularly and all measures taken to prevent unnecessary hardship. The Indians appear reconciled to their removal and travel in good order. The handwriting is neat, slanted, deliberate, the tone calm, bureaucratic." Rogers was a veteran officer. His job was to ensure that numbers matched orders, that men and wagons reached their next post. To him, the measure of success was punctuality and survival ratio. The emigrants, as he called them, were lines in a report, figures in motion across a ledger. But in another archive, a very different voice emerges. A letter written 3 days later, January 20th, 1839, by Reverend Daniel S. Buttrick, a missionary traveling with one of Ross's detachments. His words, "I cannot reconcile the reports being sent to the War Department with what we daily witness. The people are suffering beyond description. They march in frost and sleet without shoes, many without blankets. The old and the young alike fall by the way. This morning we buried 2 women and a child within sight of the soldiers' campfire. The officers speak of decorum. I hear only coughing and the rattle of wagons carrying the sick." Between the lines, his handwriting trembles, ink spreading where tears might have fallen. Buttrick was not trained as a journalist. He wrote what he saw, not what could be verified. His account, dismissed at the time as emotional, survives only because the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions kept copies in its correspondence files in Boston. 2 records, same date, same location, same event, yet worlds apart. The Army report shows efficiency. The missionary letter shows endurance. One counts, the other listens. The official figures from that winter list 124 deaths among the Cherokee detachments. Buttrick's own estimate, written privately in his journal, speaks of over 500 graves before reaching the Mississippi. The truth buried in frozen soil lies somewhere between numbers and names. To understand the rift between these accounts, you have to hear how each was recorded. Army officers wrote at their tents by lantern light, copying statistics from subordinate sergeants. Their sentences began with "pursuant to orders" and ended with "respectfully submitted." The human cost was not their metric. Missionaries wrote at roadside camps by fires that smoked more than they warmed. They did not know if their letters would reach anyone at all. They wrote for conscience, not command. And there, in that difference in audience, the divide widens. One entry from Buttrick's notebook describes January 28th, the crossing of the Mississippi near Cape Girardeau. The river was frozen in great sheets. The men broke the ice with poles to clear a passage for the flatboats. Some of the women refused to board, fearing the water spirits that had taken others. Soldiers pushed them forward. In midstream, the ice closed again. I saw a wagon sink, oxen and all. The cries echoed down the river. The officer in charge recorded no loss in his book. The corresponding Army return for that day reads, "All detachments crossed without material incident, proceeding westward in good order." 2 sentences, 4 words of summary to replace lives. Even John Ross, who moved with the leading party, noted the same contrast. In a surviving letter to his brother Lewis, written from the camp near the Mississippi, he wrote, "We have suffered much. Our people are dying daily." Yet the officers seem to think it nothing extraordinary. They record only what they can see from horseback. Ross, trained in the language of diplomacy, rarely used words of anger, but here his restraint thins. The line between witness and record was breaking. It was not deceit, not entirely. To the Army, incident meant revolt, skirmish, mutiny, not hunger, not fever. The lexicon of command could not translate suffering. The missionary's lexicon, shaped by compassion, could not translate discipline. Each saw truth through the lens of duty. Each wrote the same winter, but from opposite banks of the same river. And in the space between them lies the silence of history, a silence filled not with absence, but with language unrecognized by the other side. In February 1839, after the final detachments had crossed into Arkansas, Captain Rogers submitted his closing report to General Scott. The removal of the Cherokee Nation is now completed. Losses were light, discipline maintained, and order observed. In that sentence, the story ends efficiently, conclusively. But Buttrick's diary continues for 12 more pages. He records the graves along the trail near Dover, near the White River, near the last frozen crossing before reaching Indian Territory. He writes of a woman who carried her husband's flute for 400 miles and played it once more beside his grave before moving on. He writes of the children too weak to cry, of soldiers who shared rations despite orders not to. He writes of the night when snow fell so quietly that the sound of breathing seemed like prayer. Those details never reached the official archives. They belong to memory, not record. When the 2 documents are placed side by side, the Army's clean lines and the missionary's uneven scrawl, you can feel the friction between systems. One seeks to prove order, the other to preserve truth. Yet both are real. Both describe fragments of the same world, incomplete without the other. Rogers' dispatches ensured accountability. They kept the machinery of the state intact. Without them, we would not know the scale of the operation. Buttrick's letters restored humanity. Without them, we would not know what it felt like to stand in that wind, to bury a child, to march without shoes through snow that burned the skin. The contradiction does not cancel either version, it completes the picture. Still, a question remains. Why did they differ so greatly? Perhaps it was distance, one measured in feet, the other in feeling. Perhaps it was survival, a need to believe the system was not cruel, that obedience was not complicity, or perhaps it was simply the nature of power to define reality by what fits within its margins. In the logic of command, suffering unrecorded does not exist. In the logic of conscience, silence is the proof of its existence. Today, historians cite both accounts often in the same paragraph. One footnote leads to the National Archives, the other to a fragile notebook kept in a mission library in Massachusetts. Between them runs an invisible thread, a measure of what can and cannot be said. Listen closely to the 2 voices, and you will hear the rhythm of the trail itself, one side marching, one side mourning, both moving in parallel, never converging. The truth of that winter does not live entirely in either document. It lives in the distance between them, in the cold air that carried both ink and breath across the same frozen ground. February 1839, Western Arkansas. Arkansas. The road had turned to dust and ash. The snow that once slowed them had melted into brown rivers that sliced through the clay. Each step sank half a foot. Each wheel left a crater that filled again by morning. The soldiers called this stretch the bottom road. The Cherokee called it the place where feet forget the feeling of home. The line stretched for miles, wagons in front. Riders beside the sick and elderly carried on litters made from saplings. The morning began before light fires doused ashes. Scattered children lifted half asleep onto the wagons. The creak of harnesses blended with coughs, the slow rhythm of movement over ground that refused to dry. By then, more than 1,000 had already died. The Army no longer kept daily counts. The quartermasters noted only rations, cornmeal reduced to half-issue salt, nearly gone. When the supply wagons failed to arrive from Little Rock, the people began foraging along the roadside. They chewed bark, dug for frozen roots. Soldiers traded a handful of flour for a blanket or a knife. Everything became exchange. Each day followed the same choreography, a march, a pause, a burial. The graves were shallow, marked with stones or a split branch bound by rawhide. Some families refused to stop leaving small bundles of food beside the trail, whispering words over the earth before walking on. At the center of the line rode John Ross, his face gaunt, eyes sunken. The brass compass still hung from his neck, though he no longer looked at it. Direction no longer mattered, only endurance. Behind him walked Sally Waters, a widow from the Etowah Valley, carrying her granddaughter on her back. Each night, she boiled what little cornmeal remained, mixing it with melted snow. When the child coughed blood, she wrapped her in a shawl and kept walking. Nearby, a young soldier, Private Harlan, wrote in his journal, "They do not complain. I cannot understand it. Were we in their place, we would curse heaven, but they only sing very softly as if to the ground." He noted one song in phonetic syllables, later identified as a mourning hymn older than memory. The same melody would reappear decades later, sung by descendants at Oklahoma gatherings. The weather turned again in mid-February. A storm swept from the northwest, sleet and thunder. The tents tore apart in the wind. Wagons overturned on a ridge near the White River. The people clustered under trees, using their bodies to shield the children. Soldiers burned wagon covers for warmth. That night, 23 died of exposure. The official record lists casualties cold. Yet amid the cold, small acts of defiance persisted. A blacksmith named Kawoni managed to repair a broken wheel using iron scraps scavenged from a soldier's stove. His work saved an entire wagon of elders who could no longer walk. A woman named Ayoka carried the embers of her home fire in a small clay pot lined with moss, relighting it each evening, keeping the same flame alive from Georgia to Arkansas. Her descendants still guard that pot in a museum today, though the fire is long gone. Such details did not appear in reports, but they were the moments that made the march human, not grand, not noble, only real. As the column approached the White River, crossing the banks had turned to swamps. Horses sank to their knees. Men dragged the wagons by hand ropes biting into their palms. The water rose chest high, carrying away barrels, blankets, and a small cradle made of willow. A soldier caught it downstream, empty. Ross ordered the line to halt until the current dropped, but command from Fort Gibson demanded movement. "Proceed without delay," the courier read. So they proceeded and lost another dozen to the water. By the time they reached the opposite bank, the rain had stopped. The sun broke through clouds for the first time in weeks. The people stood silently, faces turned east. The horizon was empty. No mountains, no familiar trees, only flat land and the smell of wet earth. Reverend Buttrick, still keeping notes, wrote that day, "The people seem to breathe differently, not from relief, but from disbelief. They have reached the land promised to them, but no one speaks of arrival." Among the soldiers, fatigue bred compassion and some cruelty in others. One sergeant began sharing his coffee with a group of elders. Another was reprimanded for letting families ride in an army wagon. Yet discipline eroded in both directions. The line no longer marched, it limped. At dusk, the camps glowed with dozens of small fires. The smell of smoke and boiled corn filled the air. Some played flutes carved from river cane, their notes floating over the plain. One soldier described it as music that made even the horses stop. Children chased fireflies. Mothers mended clothes with threads pulled from unraveling shawls. In the flicker of those moments, history seemed to pause, as if the land for an instant forgave them for crossing it. But the reprieve did not last. By late February, the line reached the Arkansas River, swollen from winter melt. The ferries at Fort Smith were broken. Only small skiffs remained. The Army improvised rafts from felled trees. It took 4 days to move everyone across. Several oxen drowned, dragging supplies with them. A barrel of salt burst open midstream, dissolving into the water, a symbol too sharp to miss. When the last wagon touched the western shore, a single cheer rose from the soldiers. The Cherokee did not join. Their road was not finished. The hardest miles lay ahead. The prairie wind hit their faces like a wall. They could smell spring in the grass, but to them it carried no promise. Within that landscape of exhaustion, smaller stories unfolded, the kind that never enter treaties. A youth named Standing Elk carried his father's bow all the way from Georgia. When asked why, he said he did not want the weapon, only the weight of it. It reminded him that he once belonged somewhere. An old man refused to ride, choosing to walk the final miles barefoot. Each evening he washed his feet in a tin basin, muttering in Salagi. A soldier asked what he was saying. The interpreter replied, "He tells the ground he remembers its name." These were not gestures of rebellion, but of continuity. On a road built to erase them, they practiced remembering. When they finally reached the boundaries of Indian Territory in March 1839, they found not open refuge, but checkpoints, military posts, ration warehouses, surveyors waiting to assign plots. The promise of new land came with ledgers and chains. The people collapsed outside the gates, too tired to speak. Ross rode to the front, dismounted, and looked west, flat horizon, no rivers, no mountains. He He removed the small pouch of soil from his cloak and emptied it onto the ground. For the first time in months, he knelt. Buttrick recorded the moment. He said nothing. The people watched. Some began to cry, others turned away. It was not ceremony, only acknowledgement that the journey had ended, though the road had not. The Army's final report for that month reads, "All remaining detachments arrived in good order. Operations concluded. No further incidents." It closes the ledger neatly, as if the march could be summed by a single sentence. But the land itself held another record: hundreds of graves unmarked, dozens of fires still burning in clay pots, the sound of songs that never reached paper. For those who walked the campaign was not measured by miles or days. It was measured by the small acts that kept them alive: a repaired wheel, a handful of grain, a flame carried through rain. If you walk that route today along the ridges of Arkansas and into eastern Oklahoma, you can still trace the path in the landscape. Depressions in the earth where wagon wheels once cut deep clusters of wildflowers that grow where ashes fell. Locals say that after heavy rain, you can smell the faint scent of wood smoke rising from nowhere. That is not legend. It is residue, the chemistry of endurance written into soil. Because in the end, what turned the tide was not orders or maps, but people adapting to what could not be planned, using every fragment of skill, memory, and stubbornness to survive. The march had become its own nation, one without borders, bound together only by movement. And when they reached the far side of that endless road, they did not celebrate. They built fires, they sang low, and they waited for the next morning, when the world would demand once again that they keep walking. March 19th, 1839. The western edge of Indian Territory, near Fort Gibson. The rain had stopped, but the ground still bled water. The road narrowed between two ridges, funneling the last detachments toward the settlement point, marked on every military map as Cherokee Agency West. The soldiers called it the end of the line. For those who walked, it was the place where distance ceased to mean anything. They had traveled nearly 900 miles. Only 3 of the original 16 detachments remained on the trail. The rest had already arrived or dissolved into silence. Disease had thinned the column, so had despair. The survivors moved without rhythm, eyes fixed on the horizon as if afraid to look at the ground. John Ross rode near the front wagon. The small pouch of red earth was still tied to his belt. Behind him walked the final group of families, the sick, the widowed, the children who had outlived their parents. They followed not because they believed in a destination, but because turning back no longer existed. That morning a low mist hugged the valley. The air smelled of wet pine and smoke from 1,000 small fires. The Army quartermasters had already set up camp near the creek, preparing to issue final rations. From their vantage point, the mission was complete. All detachments accounted for, one officer wrote, "Arrival imminent." But within the Cherokee line, another event was unfolding, one that would never enter those records. Ross's wife, Quady, who had fallen ill during the final week, was carried in a wagon covered with canvas. Fever had set in days earlier, her breath shallow, her hands cold, despite the fire burning near her. They reached the river crossing at sundown. The ferries could take no more that night, so the detachment halted on the eastern bank. Ross dismounted, unrolled his cloak beside the wagon, and sat in silence. Witnesses say he held her hand until dawn. At sunrise, the frost lay on her hair. She was gone. The missionary Daniel Buttrick recorded, "Mrs. Ross departed this life before reaching the western shore. The chief remained by her body a long time, speaking to no one. When at last he rose, he gave orders to bury her by the river. No ceremony, only a prayer whispered in our tongue. The soldiers offered to fire a salute. Ross declined. No more sound, he said. The ground has heard enough." They marked the grave with a cedar cross cut from a wagon beam. The river below carried ice thin and glassy. It moved west, reflecting the dawn. That was the point, the unrecorded moment when the road stopped being a journey and became a boundary. From that day, none would speak of returning east. The mountains were behind them. The river was the last door closing. When the column moved again, it did so quietly. Even the children stopped singing. Only the creak of wheels and the jingle of harness chains broke the air. Buttrick wrote, "The silence was heavier than any sound. They walked as if crossing into another world. By mid-morning, they reached the fort. Soldiers stood in formation, muskets shining. The officer in command, Major Page, read aloud the closing directive from Washington. The Cherokee people have been successfully removed to the lands assigned to them by treaty. Further operations are hereby suspended." He signed the final page, folded it, and sealed it with wax. The last line in the government ledger reads, "All accounted for." But in Ross's journal, this someday carries a different sentence, the last he would write before the page ends, mid-line. "We have come to the place where maps end, and the counting of our dead cannot be finished." The ink fades there, bleeding into the paper, as if the words themselves refused to continue. That night, rain began again. The new camp was a tangle of mud and canvas. Families built fires inside shallow pits to shield them from wind. A few soldiers brought supplies from the Fort Flour Salt Tobacco and left them without a word. In one tent, a boy recited the syllabary by firelight, his mother tracing the symbols in the dirt. It was the only lesson that survived the road. Ahioka's clay pot still glowed faintly, the last ember of the homeland fire. She placed it near the stream, refilled it with ash, and covered it for the night. The flame had shrunk to a coal, but it still lived. Ross walked alone to the edge of the camp. He looked east, though there was nothing to see but darkness. Behind him, the people slept scattered among tents and wagons. Before him, the prairie stretched endless and bare. He spoke once to no one in particular. There will be no more removal. It was not a command, it was a vow. The next morning, the officers assembled to distribute land parcels. Surveyors with chains and compasses marked boundaries, driving stakes into the wet soil. The new map began square plots replacing valleys' numbered sections, where rivers once named themselves. The people watched expressionless. The language of land had changed again. When the final line was drawn, a soldier folded the map and handed it to Ross. He held it only a moment before passing it back. "Keep it," he said. "We will remember without it." That refusal was small, almost unnoticed. But it was the first act of resistance in the new land, the quiet beginning of survival as a nation without borders. As weeks passed, disease continued to claim lives in the camp. Cholera struck again in April, taking dozens before they could build permanent shelters. Yet the people began to rebuild not out of hope, but necessity. They planted corn in the wet fields using spoons and bits of bone as tools. They shaped logs into cabins using wagon planks for doors. They sang at night, low rhythmic, as if keeping time with the earth's slow recovery. Buttrick's still writing filled his last notebook page with a single sentence. "The march has ended, but its sound continues in every heart." Then the entries stop. The next page is blank, torn halfway through. Perhaps the wind caught it. Perhaps he could not write more. Either way, the record ends there, the physical proof of exhaustion, the silence of completion. For the Army, the operation closed neatly. Supplies accounted, men discharged, equipment returned. General Scott submitted his final report to Washington on May 24, 1839, writing, "The task entrusted to me has been executed with humanity and precision." That word humanity would echo bitterly in the years to come. But for the moment, it stood unchallenged, stamped and filed among thousands of others in the War Department's correspondence. No annotation mentions Quoddy Ross. No line acknowledges the graves without names. The official story ends where the paper runs out. On the ground, the story lingered longer. In June, the surviving detachments gathered at Tahlequah to choose a new council site. The ceremony was simple. They placed a cedar branch on the soil, and an elder spoke. No one recorded his words. But witnesses remembered the final line, "We are still the people." From that declaration, the Cherokee Nation began again, fractured, grieving, but unbroken. The road east was gone. The treaties could not be undone. The land they now stood on was foreign, yet it would become the center of everything that survived. That was the point of no return, not a moment of defeat, but the irreversible pivot from memory to endurance. Years later, when Ross would speak before Congress, he carried with him only one object, the small brass compass. Its face was tarnished, its needle unsteady. When asked if it still worked, he smiled faintly and said, "It points home." He never said where that was. And in the archives, if you look for the records of that final week, the ferries, the burials, the names, you find pages missing. A ledger with its last sheet torn clean, a diary ending mid-sentence. The paper ends where silence begins. That silence is the true document, the point at which a nation was remade not by victory or defeat, but by the impossibility of going back. The wind moves through that valley, still carrying fragments of song across the open ground. No monument marks the spot. Only the sound remains, the faint echo of footsteps and the promise whispered beside a river grave. No more removal. Summer 1839 Indian Territory. The roads that had swallowed the Cherokees ended in open prairie where the grass moved like an ocean, and the sky had no boundaries. The first rains came early, turning the ground soft enough for planting. The survivors of the trail, what remained of nearly 16,000 souls, began to build again. They dug shallow wells, raised cabins of cottonwood and pine. Wagons were dismantled for doors. The sick lay under makeshift shelters near the Illinois River, tended by missionaries and midwives who had survived the march. Within a year, over 4,000 were buried in this new soil. Their names filled no ledger, but the people kept them in song verses, murmured before sunrise fragments of syllables that carried across the prairie wind. That summer marked the first season of survival. The second would demand something harder, rebuilding a nation from its broken halves. July 12, 1839, Tahlequah, Indian Territory. At the confluence of two streams, elders gathered beneath a cedar arbor. They had chosen this place as the capital of the new Cherokee Nation, the name itself meaning the place where two are one. Here, for the first time since removal, the council met. John Ross presided, thinner now, voice rough from months of illness. Across from him sat men who had once signed the Treaty of New Echota, Major Ridge's followers, the Treaty Party. Between them hung 20 yards of silence thicker than any smoke. The air trembled with unresolved memory. Ross spoke first. "We are upon new land, but we remain one people. Let us make a law that remembers." For a moment it seemed possible, but the fracture that had begun years earlier between those who resisted and those who signed would not heal. That night, as fires burned low across the camp, 3 shots cracked through the dark. Major Ridge was dead. His son John Ridge followed within days. Elias Boudinot, the publisher of the Cherokee Phoenix, was struck down near the mission house. Retaliation came swiftly and silently. Families fled north, factions armed themselves. The new nation was born in blood, not ceremony. Ross denounced the killings, yet power settled around him. In September 1839, a new constitution was drafted, modeled on the one lost in Georgia but hardened by exile. It declared Tahlequah the permanent seat of government and established a Supreme Court, schools, and a council system that mirrored the structure of the old nation. The preamble read, "We, the people of the Cherokee Nation, in order to establish justice and preserve peace, do ordain and establish this Constitution." It was both repetition and resistance, an act of remembering written in ink that refused to fade. 1840-1846, the fragile years. The nation tried to rebuild amid hunger and resentment. Crops failed in the first 2 seasons. Floods took the second harvest. The government in Washington reduced rations, arguing that the Cherokee had sufficient land to provide for themselves. Schools reopened, taught in both English and Cherokee. Children learned to read the syllabary from carved wooden tablets. Missionaries established presses again, small hand-cranked machines printing Bibles and laws on rough paper imported from St. Louis. Yet the shadow of division lingered. The U.S. Indian agent stationed at Fort Gibson reported constant distrust between factions. Secret councils formed in remote valleys. Old alliances, Bird Clan, Wolf Clan, Deer Clan, resurfaced as fault lines. Ross wrote to Congress in 1842, pleading for protection from domestic violence born of old treaties. He warned that the wound of removal continues to bleed. That same year, another tragedy struck. Dozens of enslaved people, held by wealthy mixed-heritage Cherokee, revolted, fleeing toward Mexico. The incident fractured the nation again, forcing the council to confront questions of freedom and bondage within their own ranks. By 1846, after years of political stalemate, the United States intervened. The Treaty of 1846 required the Cherokee Nation to reconcile all factions and to cede further land for Western expansion. It was signed in Washington. Ross, representing the National Party, and Stan Waddy, nephew of Major Ridge, for the treaty faction. The document began, "Peace is hereby restored among the Cherokee people." But peace on paper did not erase the geography of loss. The land they were promised, 14 million acres, would shrink again in decades to come. Each line drawn by surveyors sliced another memory away from its roots. 1850s, the second removal by other names. Tahlequah grew churches, a courthouse, the Cherokee Female Seminary, one of the first institutions for women west of the Mississippi. Literacy rose. The Cherokee Advocate newspaper circulated news across the territory. Yet, progress had a hidden cost. As missionaries expanded schools, they also imported a policy that would later harden into law, the education of Native children apart from their families. By 1856, the first boarding schools operated under federal supervision. Attendance was nominally voluntary, but coercion followed soon after. Children were taught English exclusively, their hair cut short, their language forbidden. In the school registers, surnames replaced clan names, and the syllabary was erased from lessons. The sound of the old songs grew fainter. Ross protested the policy, writing to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, "You have removed us from our land. Must you also remove us from ourselves?" His letter was acknowledged, then filed without reply. 1861-1865, the Civil War and another fracture. When the American Civil War erupted, the Cherokee were forced again to choose sides. Ross urged neutrality, but Stan Waddy, now a Confederate colonel, drew hundreds to his cause. Brother fought brother. Forts burned. The land that had been refuge turned once more into battlefield. In 1863, the Union-allied Cherokee signed another treaty abolishing slavery within their nation. 2 years later, Ross traveled again to Washington, an old man now, to secure recognition for the survivors. He died in 1806, months before the new treaty was signed. His coffin was carried through Tahlequah by torchlight, the people singing in Salagi, the same low melody that had followed the march decades earlier. That treaty, the Treaty of 1806, marked both end and beginning. It restored a portion of land, but demanded new concessions: right of U.S. citizenship for freedmen, railroads through Cherokee land, and a surrender of autonomy that would grow with each passing year. The map changed again, boundaries dissolving under the weight of progress. 1870s, 1890s, the quiet erasure. Rail lines cut through the old migration routes. Towns with English names replaced those in Cherokee. Tahlequah survived, but Anikawi became Bird Creek. Ustanaula turned to Red Bank. Surveyors carved Oklahoma Territory from what remained. Homesteaders arrived under the Dawes Act of 1887, claiming parcels of unused land. By the 1890s, communal landholding was abolished. Each family received an allotment deed, often fraudulent, often stolen. The Dawes rolls recorded ancestry in columns of blood quantum, dividing people into fractions for bureaucratic convenience. Identity itself became arithmetic. In 1898, the Curtis Act dissolved the Cherokee courts and government. The Capitol at Tahlequah fell silent. The council house boarded up. The old Constitution, the one written after the trail, was voided by statute. The new map of Oklahoma absorbed it all. The nation on paper ceased to exist. 1907. Its datehood. Oklahoma entered the Union. The headlines in Eastern newspapers called it the closing of the frontier. But for those whose frontier had been forced upon them, it marked another ending. Yet even as political lines erased the old nation, the people continued planting, teaching, praying in their own tongue. Families preserved the syllabary in hidden notebooks. Songs once whispered on the trail were sung again at harvest gatherings. The clay pot of Ahioka's fire survived in a private home near Tahlequah. The ember now turned to ash, but the story still told. A generation later, the echo. By 1910, only a handful of the original march survivors remained. Their testimonies, collected by the Indian Pioneer Project in the 1930s, speak with a voice both weary and steady. One elder, Liza Brown, age 94, told the interviewer, "I remember the sound of the wagons. They never stopped. The soldiers said we were safe now, but the road never ended. Even when we built houses, it still felt like walking." Those words outlast every document. The new map. From the vantage point of a century, the transformation is visible in 3 lines of ink. 1838 to 1839, removal of map race. 1839-1846, reconstruction. Reconstruction, a map rewritten. 1806-1907, absorption, a map dissolved. Each phase left its trace: treaties, schools, railroads, laws. Yet beneath them all runs the invisible geography of memory rivers renamed graves, unmarked songs still carried in wind. The new map was not drawn on paper. It was carved into people, into their bodies, their language, their silence. Today, the Cherokee Nation lives again. Government restored in 1975, schools teaching both English and Tsalagi. The newspaper Cherokee Phoenix printed once more in the syllabary Sequoyah created 2 centuries ago. The capital is still Tahlequah. The council house stands rebuilt on its old foundations. But if you walk behind it down to the small cemetery on the hill, you find a single stone carved with simple words. John Ross, 1790 to 1866, Principal Chief. Beneath the dates, another line faint from rain. The ground remembers. The map that was fractured in 1838 did not vanish. It changed form from borders to memory, from territory to time. Every treaty, every law, every erased name became another contour of survival. Because a nation can lose its land and still remain as long as someone remembers where the rivers once began. Tahlequah, present day. Mist rises from the Illinois River as sunlight spreads across the valley. Each October, the Cherokee Nation gathers for homecoming, a commemoration of endurance. Songs once whispered along the trail are sung aloud. Dancers form circles on the grass. Children wear ribbons of red and black, and elders tell stories that begin with a date when we walked west. They call it continuity. At the center of the grounds stands the Trail of Tears, memorial flame burning day and night, with cedar wood brought from both ends of the journey. Nearby lies Ross Cemetery, its limestone markers softened by moss. Visitors leave small offerings, beads, river stones, folded notes. Each spring, students from the immersion school walk there in silence. Their teacher reads from John Ross's final letter. The ground remembers what people forget. The children reply in English. The earth keeps the story. Along the removal routes through Tennessee and Arkansas, small markers trace the path. In winter, frost outlines their shapes like faint wagon tracks. In North Carolina, the eastern band of Cherokee still live in the Qualla boundary. Elders teach carving, weaving, and oral history. One said, "They took us from the land, but they could not take the sound." Her students repeat those stories as lessons in continuity. Each march, a group retraces part of the original route. They walk quietly, carrying wooden staffs marked with clan symbols. The journey begins near Fort Cass and ends at the Arkansas River. At unmarked burial grounds, they read aloud names recovered from archives. One young participant wrote afterward, "I used to think the trail was about sorrow, but it's about direction. Even when everything was gone, our people still knew which way to walk." Inside the Cherokee Heritage Center, old council minutes rest beside digital copies. Leather-bound volumes share shelves with transcribed journals of the removal period. A label on one box reads, "These are not relics, they are instructions." For a people once defined by erasure, memory functions as governance. Language became a map of return. When the written system nearly vanished in the early 1900s, teachers revived it through small readers and community classes. Each symbol reflected a river or ridge from the original homeland. Speaking it aloud became a form of geography. At the Cherokee Immersion School mornings begin with a pledge. We stand where our ancestors once stood. The students repeat it until it becomes routine language rather than ceremony. Music preserved the same memory. Hymns first sung during removal continue in churches across Oklahoma and North Carolina. The most enduring is Amazing Grace. The melody carried west in 1838 remains central to memorial gatherings. It has shifted from lament to continuity. At the bluff where Quady Ross was buried, the Arkansas River moves steadily westward. 2 centuries later, the boundaries drawn in 1838 persist in law and geography, yet memory continues through practice, planting corn in traditional rows, burning cedar in the morning air, teaching children the original meanings of place names. At the Cherokee National History Museum, visitors can view an interactive map restoring those names. Chattanooga, the guide explains, once meant the rock that points the way. Each restoration returns a fragment of sound to the map. The Cherokee Phoenix is printed again in the writing system created by Sequoia. The council house in Tahlequah stands rebuilt. The government, once declared removed, now operates under its own constitution. History, once the record of displacement, documents survival. Behind the council house stands a single headstone, John Ross, 1790 to 1866, Principal Chief. Below the inscription reads, "The ground remembers." The map fractured in 1838 did not disappear. It changed form from borders to memory, from territory to time. Every treaty renamed river and unmarked grave became another contour of endurance. A nation can lose its land and still remain as long as someone remembers where the rivers began. When the homecoming ends each October, the memorial flame continues through the night. The fire stands as a point of continuity, its smoke rising into open air. It carries the names unrecorded and the voices that never vanished. The ground remembers, and the wind still carries the sound of those who kept walking. You've been listening to The Trail of Tears, a Path Written in Silence. The record is never closed, only continued. Every document ends, but memory doesn't. What should we preserve, the facts or the feeling they left behind? Tell me what matters more to you and why.